seafood plant. Other people have had their managers come into their home and sexual assault and rape. All of these obviously violations of the law. But if we take it to something that's not as shocking and clearly regulated by law for employees, number of hours worked and wage. Ana Rosa was working 24-hour shifts. In addition, she was paid significantly below wage and no overtime. Because she was not an employee of the corporation, Walmart can say it's not our problem. Legally, not our problem, it's CJ Seafoods. But it does become Walmart's problem due to public scrutiny. And who buys? It's the public. Who buys Walmart goods? It's the public. So this is part of the trigger of my argument, relying mostly on public scrutiny, as we have seen in another example I will show you in a moment. So that's Ana Rosa down in Louisiana very recently. Here's another example, just to give you some context. This is Raul Lopez, and he was working in a meat packing plant in, oh my goodness, where was this? I think it was actually in Colorado. Oh, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the meatpacking plant had very slippery conditions, and due to poor ventilation, it was fogging up in the meatpacking plant because it's kept cold. And something went wrong with the machinery, and he had chainmail gloves on because he was ripping the hides from the carcasses. But it caught on a hook, and it dragged him. And you can see here his left arm is useless because it dragged him, and it's interesting, in the analysis, his coworker took what's called extraordinary measures. And what do you think those extraordinary measures were? Yeah, shutting the machine off is considered an extraordinary measure. Initially, there was a pause among people just watching him being dragged because they knew that they could possibly be beaten, for instance. Yeah, that pressure. Exactly, slow down production, halt production. So he now, his arm's useless as a result of this, but he was, the company I'm trying to remember the name of the company here, I'm just drawing a blank. ConAgra, it was ConAgra, what am I thinking? ConAgra did pay for his initial treatment to stop the bleeding, et cetera, but now he's 26 years old, is debating amongst itself whether they will pay for this operation that may provide him some utility of his arm. There's none now, or just he'll have to have it amputated. But the meat packing plant is the focus here, that it was not up to code, essentially, and as a result, he suffered another injury, or an injury. Hurting is another one that we don't necessarily think about. This is interesting, I was reading this. It said one night in 2000, Demigio, a Peruvian shepherd, collapsed on the doorstep of a local farmer, feverish and frail. He had spent the past 4 days walking through mountains and pastures to escape his employer, a prominent local landowner who he alleged had thrown him to the ground in a fit of rage. His boss had housed him in a tent for months at a time and frequently failed to provide him sufficient food, leaving him half-starved in remote areas of arid highland. It wasn't Peru, it was Colorado. And apparently, this is not a one-off event, and these are suppliers of, in this case, sheep. Part of my problem is that I'm not very versed in what meat is provided by sheep, but essentially the meat that's provided by sheep to the big corporations come from prominent landowners like this. Once again, the corporation is able to other the situations here. Garment industry is another one. We've seen several cases in California and New York. Farming, definitely in California and Texas. These issues come up very frequently but are kind of coast under the radar. We have forced labor. We actually have individuals who are shipped here illegally. That's a totally different issue. What I'm focusing on, as I mentioned, are the people who are legally employed here, refugees being the primary group of individuals because it's very easy to identify their vulnerability. But the last bullet point here, identifies several of the issues confronted by these individuals, whether they're refugees or immigrants, that the corporation is allowed by law to ignore, particularly if the individuals are not employed directly under the corporation's auspices. So one being the minimum wage issue, extremely long hours, child labor, verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, unhealthy and inhumane working conditions, and some of it has to do with inhaling toxic odors, hearing loud, damaging noise so you lose your hearing, unsanitary facilities which can cause slip, fall, broken machines, etc. Anyway, I adopted this interesting approach set forth by a scholar in the area of immigrant rights, but she was focusing on this sector of employment between the US and Mexico, which is essentially an area where manufacturers can make goods for free and avoid tax issues coming back into the United States. And she identified that there's this group of individuals working there who are from Mexico, and they've developed a system where they live that doesn't comply with the laws, and they're allowed to continue in this way. And when I mention that doesn't comply with the law, they don't have zoning, they don't have streets or sidewalks, they don't have maybe compliant structures, but it provides them homes, okay? So she sets forth this argument that there's an internal third world in this maquiladora area. I want to adopt that approach here, that in these facilities, these corporate facilities, whether it's the farm, whether it's the meat packing plant, you name it, that there's this internal third world where, for instance, in Nebraska, the Burmese, the Bhutanese, the Vietnamese, Latin Americans come together and they're working. There is inequality, as she set forth, inequality and illegality set forth in these organizations because they're not compliant with labor requirements or OSHA, etc. But there is a certain benefit that inures in that it allows a bunch of refugees, for instance, to be employed. So while it's not compliant, and there are huge problems with that, it also provides opportunities for these individuals. And there's a psychology behind this, essentially, of putting oneself at risk in order to pursue the opportunity. And this is set forth, or particularly aggravated by the vulnerability that refugees experience. She also described this as experience in localized globalization in these types of facilities. So if we have these third world, internal third worlds, right in the facilities that either are directly run by or indirectly run by the corporations, what can we do about it? And this is where corporate social responsibility is triggered. When we're talking about corporate social responsibility, most people are familiar with the concept that, or concepts like corporate philanthropy, sustainability, business ethics. And this is the approach that I would like to adopt because there's so many different forms of defining corporate social responsibility. When a corporation's policies and decision-making reflect the potential impact of its corporate actions on various other stakeholders besides the common shareholder. Which brings us to corporate law. Under corporate law, the common shareholder does not need to be the only focus of corporate management's attention. When a corporation, a for-profit corporation, is formed, the primary purpose is profit maximization for the investors, the shareholders, right? But as set forth even before 1919, but very clearly in 1919, the Dodge v. Ford court indicated that management's conduct can't be merely for the incidental benefit of shareholders and for the primary purpose of benefiting others. You have to flip-flop it. It has to be primarily for the benefit of the shareholders. But it does not exclude what under law has come to be known as other constituencies. And these other constituencies are employees, whether directly or indirectly. It's this population that I've identified here of refugees. It may also be the environment. It may also be consumers. Consumers are not considered part of the primary focus of corporations, unless, of course, it has to do with the bottom line. There is no law saying, unless there's a contract, but there's no law specifically saying that corporate management owes any kind of fiduciary duty to care for or have any kind of loyalty to these other constituencies. In many states, there are other constituency statutes that allow it, but don't require it. The ALI principle, section 2.01, sets forth the standards that management may take into account ethical considerations that are reasonably regarded as appropriate to the reasonable conduct of business. And 3, may devote a reasonable amount of resources to public welfare, humanitarian, educational, and philanthropic purposes. This is not a requirement? Yes. Yeah. That's true, that the may and the use of the word may in the ALI principles and the fact that there are other words that are open to a lot of interpretation does not make this a very strong argument. There is no very strong argument under law. Basically, it allows them to consider, management to consider these issues, but they must, like you said, consider the shareholders' interests at some level, depending on what state you're in. No, good question. ALI principles are not laws, they are guidance. And so for instance, how this would work is that in a state in the US, there are other constituency statutes that have somewhat of a resonance like this ALI principle, but it doesn't have as much strength as this ALI principle. They may look to the ALI principle and then their legislatures adopt it, so they can incorporate it in to their law of the state. But there is no federal law with regards to this, and the ALI principles are guidance. American Legal Institute. It's associated with the ABA, so the American Bar Association. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the American Bar Association sets forth a lot of great recommendations in several areas, including corporate governance, which is what this is about, corporate social responsibility being a subset of corporate governance. So, because there is no clear law that says these other constituencies must be recognized in any shape or form other than if there was a contract, and the current law doesn't seem to be working on some of these issues, my recommendation piggybacks off of a step that was recently taken under Dodd-Frank. Under Dodd-Frank, Congress took a step that was a bit of a shock to the business law community, and it set forth in section 1502 that the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, should develop rules and regulations that require disclosure by corporations of use of certain conflict minerals. Specifically, many times when people hear conflict minerals, they think immediately of blood diamonds. That's not what this is aimed at. It could have been, but this is specifically minerals that come from the Democratic Republic of Congo and surrounding areas that are usually used in, and I don't have my iPhone or my BlackBerry, but in PDAs, so titanium is an example. But they usually have to do with electronic devices, and the companies that produce, directly or indirectly, these types of widgets that use the conflict minerals, first of all, they have to find out if they use them, and many times that requires digging to a supplier who has to dig through to a supplier who has to figure out from another supplier if for instance, titanium is being used. So it's very expensive and time-consuming. In addition, after they do this quote-unquote due diligence to find out if they even need to respond to the regulations further, if they do use conflict minerals, and per se, a conflict mineral, if it comes from outside of this geographical location, is not a conflict mineral. It has to come from the DRC or surrounding countries. They have to do a more extensive due diligence, arguably, and make disclosure publicly that they are using these minerals. The reason this is being done is that the Congress hopes to encourage peacemaking. So when 1502 was enacted, the SEC, the reaction of the SEC was, we've never done anything like this before, put in the role of a peacekeeper. But they responded and they came forward with rules and regs, and they have a whole process. The SEC in general has a process that they go through when they're contemplating putting forth regulation. There's a comment period. So corporations, other interest groups can step forward and say, we don't like this, we like this, change this, don't change that. And the comment period was extended on the regulation for Dodd-Frank, or 1502, from 1 month to almost 3 months. And they got thousands of communications, I'll say, because it was all different kinds of input. So what ends up happening is it allows the public to be the end police on this, essentially. By making this issue transparent, it allows the public to know what's going on and therefore make a decision as to whether or not to buy the iPhone or to buy the other good that's using these issues, or these minerals. My suggestion is to adopt something very similar. Granted, we may need to fund the SEC a bit more so that they can have more people to work there and actually time to do this kind of regulatory step. But if we can do it for peacekeeping in the Democratic Republic of Congo, why can't we do it locally? My suggestion is that for those organizations that hire refugees and immigrants, directly or indirectly, they have to do the due diligence to find this out. They have to make disclosure as to whether or not they're compliant with the laws. Because it's not that there aren't laws out there, it's just that the laws are either inadequate or not enforced. Therefore, as we've seen with the CJ Seafoods, Walmart initially took hands-off approach. Wow. There are abuses of the law and potentially human rights issues at CJ Seafoods. We don't know anything about it. Othering. But under public scrutiny and people asking questions and pushing on the issue, Walmart has actually stepped forward and said, we're not going to buy from the likes of these type of people. And they've gone further than CJ Seafoods and actually looked at other suppliers. This is the kind of reaction from public scrutiny that my suggestion would hope to achieve by making the transparency foremost so that we will know what's going on. Let me see, is there anything else? No. Are there any other questions? Yes. Well, who's enforcing the labor laws? Because that seems what's mostly violated. The Department of Labor, and depending on it, whether it's federal or state regulators,